This is the 46 of 46 podcast Summit Sessions, where we'll talk all things Adirondack, backcountry, and beyond. From high peak stories and adventures to trail tips and tricks, we'll dive deep into the heart of these mountains and the people who passionately climb them. Adirondack maps and spruce traps, bushwhacks and backpacks. It's all here on the 46 of 46 Summit Sessions. Welcome back to another episode of the Summit Sessions here on the 46 of 46 podcast. Today I'll be speaking with an Adirondack hiker and author who has one of the most impressive outdoor resumes you'll ever come across, period, let alone when it comes to the Adirondacks. He's summited over 2,000 peaks in his life, including all 217 3,000 footers in the Adirondacks during the winter. He's climbed every peak over 3,000 feet in New England. He's hiked the Florida Trail, the Long Trail. He's thru-hiked the Smoky Mountains, and so many more. On top of his accolades in the woods, he is the founder of the TransADK route, which is a 240-mile thru-hike from the top of the Adirondack Park to the bottom. He's an Army veteran, a former backcountry ranger, a trail builder, an Appalachian trail caretaker, and an avid toponym researcher and the author of 7 books, most of which focus on the Adirondack Park. And he's also a licensed therapist specializing in work with fellow veterans. When it comes to his outdoors experience, this is just the tip of the iceberg. His name is Erik Schlimmer, and he's here to talk all about it today. Erik, welcome to the show, and thanks for coming on the 46 of 46 podcast.
Thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
So you've hiked pretty extensively all over the country, and you've pretty much hiked everywhere in the Northeast. So give me a quick backstory into your life. How'd you get into the outdoors, hiking, and all of that jazz? And then how did the Adirondacks become your home field?
Well, getting up to the Adirondacks and getting into hiking, I assure you it was not voluntary. What happened, I was born in Poughkeepsie, New York in 1973. It's an urban environment. And in 1985, my parents sat down, me and my big sister, and they said, "Kids, we're moving to Chestertown." And we probably said something to the effect of, "Where the hell is Chestertown?" And they go, "Oh, you're going to love it. It's way up in the mountains." And we probably have this nervous expressions on our faces. Where are our parents dragging us? So we arrive in Chestertown, and boy, what a change from growing up in a big city. At the time, the high school graduating class of Chestertown was probably fewer than 30 students. At least back then, to find any real sign of civilization, you had to drive a half hour to Glens Falls. And I was not a happy camper. It was kind of like moving to a Russian fur trading outpost.
Yeah, that sounds about right. From Poughkeepsie.
Yeah, to a 12-year-old, it was pretty dramatic change. So, of course, I show up in the 8th grade, and one of the questions I have for my newfound peers is, "What on earth do you people do up here?" And they gave me a funny look, and they said, "My goodness, what are you talking about? There's plenty to do up here. We ride ATVs, and we fish, and we hunt, and snowboards had just come out at the time, so we go snowboarding, and mountain bikes had just come out, so we go mountain biking, and we drink canned beer in the woods around bonfires, and there's never things to run out of to do here in Chestertown." And hey, when in Rome.
Absolutely.
And, so made some friends, started recreating outside, and as they say, the rest is history.
Yeah, that sounds like quite the change from Poughkeepsie, that's for sure. Especially Chestertown being in, a very small town.
Yeah, it's pretty small. I graduated high school in 1991. There were 32 students, and it's changed a little. Warrensburg, the next town down, is kind of like almost a suburb of Glens Falls now. So in the last 20, 30 years, it's been built up a little. But at the time, the move seemed like a just a terrible, terrible idea. But in hindsight, if that move had never happened, I would have never fallen in love with the mountains.
Sure. Life changing at that point for you.
Sure.
You moved up here. At this point now, you've spent, what was it, over 1,000 nights in the woods. You've hiked. How many miles in your life do you think you've hiked?
A good guess is 15,000.
So clearly, I'd say it worked out pretty well for you. Was there any specific experience or something you did that made you decide that your whole life was going to basically revolve around the outdoors?
Yeah, it's one of those, what came first, the chicken or the egg? I never specifically set out to climb thousands of mountains or hike thousands of miles. It just kind of happened, and that happened in the mid 1990s. So I graduated high school and I went into the Army for a couple years, and I was in the infantry. And if there's any organization that can ruin hiking and camping, it's the Army. I mean, uh, it's a very miserable style of being in the woods, being in the infantry. And so I got out of the Army in the early 90s and I said, oh my God, I'm never sleeping in the woods again. I'm never carrying a backpack again. What a terrible experience. But hey, how soon we forget. And eventually started hiking in the Adirondacks, and I've got my pack back on and I'm sleeping out. And I just fell in love with it for a bunch of reasons. I really like being accountable for my own actions. So especially when I'm out there by myself in the middle of nowhere, I have to plan, if it's a long distance hike, where am I going to get water? Where am I going to camp? Where am I going to get food? If it's a bushwhack, what is the correct bearing? How do I stay on it? How am I not going to get lost? And it's just a refreshing level of being accountable for every decision I make. 97% of my time in the woods is spent solo. So if I mess something up, it's on me. So I just found the mountains addictive for many reasons. The responsibility, the beauty, the peace and quiet, the sense of accomplishment. And I think that's one of the reasons I kind of like the military, is it's a very specific goal that you reach, and you reach it. And then you just go on to the next goal and the next goal and the next goal. And you never really slow down. You never stop. And that, I think, transferred into my style of hiking.
And now at this point, fast forward, now you've visited every topographic feature within all of these places. Let me list them for the people listening. The Hammond Pond Wild Forest, the Hoffman Notch Wilderness Area, the Giant Mountain Wilderness Area, the Lake George Wild Forest, the Siamese Ponds Wilderness Area, the Farrow Lake Wilderness, Shaker Mountain Wild Forest, the Silver Lake Wilderness, and the Wilcox Lake Wild Forest. That is a lot of places to have explored every feature within those areas. It is out of control, the amount of time you've spent in the woods here in the Adirondacks.
Yeah, it sounds like I have a lot of spare time. I think it mainly comes down to just being passionate. Those named features, I think that's about maybe 500 or 600 features, but it's across almost 900,000 acres of state land. So I've really gotten into these nooks and crannies. Most of them don't have trails. Trails don't reach these features, and that's my forte, is just traveling off trail to these little hidden gems. And what's neat about bushwhacking and visiting these features nobody else really goes to is the feeling of timelessness is very comforting to me. So I don't know. Let's say I visit a remote pond in Hammond Pond Wild Forest. Maybe somebody was there last deer hunting season. Maybe somebody was there 90 years ago as a timber cruiser or a logger. You just don't know. And so it feels very timeless. And I think that equates it feeling very wild.
Yeah, absolutely. So now you're an author. You've written a number of books. You've also created the TransADK route. So you're a bit of a creator as well as a hiker. So in case you guys don't know, listening, the TransADK route is a route that goes from the top of the park all the way to the bottom. And Erik is the person who created that. So take us through, why did you put it together? How did you figure out the route? And take us from the start.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of things that happen in my life, I'm kind of usually the last one to find out. I do a lot of things that aren't necessarily intentional. It's just that's how it works out in life, and that's how the TransADK route came into being. So we have to go back to 2010, and in 2010, I decided that I was going to hike across the entire Adirondack Park because I wanted to combine long distance travel with my love for the Adirondacks. So I stood on the northern border of the park, 8 miles from Canada. And to make a long story short, 12 days later and 240 miles, I reached the southern border of the Adirondack Park, becoming the first modern day hiker to cross the entire park. And, I just did it for fun. I had a couple weeks off. I don't know. I like to hike. And that
Sure.
was really the extent of the story. It was nothing special, no plan whatsoever to do anything when I got to the other end of the park. But I got to the other end and I was thinking about this amazing journey of over 200 miles. And I said, wow, it was wild and beautiful, challenging, scenic, unique. I went to some popular places. I went to places where nobody really goes. I hiked through sections of the park I knew very well. I hiked through a lot of parts of the park I had never heard of, let alone been to. And that's when I said, I bet somebody else would like to hike this thing. And so I wrote a guidebook and came out with a map set. And I have done a fair amount of speaking and promotion and just putting the word out about the route. And I was right. Other people do want to hike this thing. We're up to, I think, 14 successful through hikers, but about that same amount have attempted the route and not been able to finish for a whole host of reasons. So the route officially opened in 2013, and so we're getting about 2 through hikers a year.
Okay, sure. Now, when you got to the top of the park and you were about to start this trip just for fun, why not? You had the time. How did you plan out where you were going to go, since you were kind of going on kind of both figuratively and literally unmapped territory going from top to bottom? So how did you plan out where you were going to go, which ultimately, I assume, became what the actual TransADK route is?
Right. So the route combines um, a couple different styles of trails and corridors and stuff like that. It's a combination of paved roads, not very much. They're mostly in the very northern section of the route because there's not really much state land there. And if there is state land, there aren't really any trails.
Mm-hmm.
It uses traditional hiking paths, snowmobile trails, and then there are a couple little gaps. So let's say you have a trail that goes 5 miles into the woods and dead ends. But then if you climb over a ridge, you can find another trail on the backside. There are a couple instances like that where there are short sections of off trail travel to meet up with a road, to meet up with a trail, to fill in those little gaps. The majority of the route, I think we're up to 190 miles, is just straight up hiking trails. The rest, a combination of roads, off trail travel, and snowmobile trails.
Are there maps for snowmobile trails? I assume, in my mind, snowmobile trails is kind of like something people do in the winter. Are there actual trails that are designated for snowmobile trails?
Yeah, and that's where I got confusing in the beginning. So there are snowmobile trails in New York State that traverse state land. And so the snowmobile trails on the TransADK route are on state land and they can be used year round for whatever purpose you want to be out there for. Um, in the northern part of the Adirondacks, which are near the TransADK route, there's actually an extensive series of snowmobile trails, but they are on private property. And so how it works is you can only use them in the winter on a snowmobile if you belong to a local snowmobile trail club, which leases the rights to use the trail, and therefore you are insured as a user. So it's well, I shouldn't say it's a gray area. It's actually a black and white area.
Mm-hmm.
Snowmobile trails are Kind of an odd